Alex Inglot. Well, great to have you on the joy of paddle. You and I say I saw your name so often coming across in LinkedIn. I got a chance to play with your brother Dom, maybe three or four times in paddle. Anyway, several times. Always enjoyed that competition on the paddle court, despite his height and his feisty and feisty and rapid and good volleys. And you are all over the place in paddle. So you've got your podcast, all the angles about paddle, the business of paddle, which is fascinating. In your own words, Alex, I mean, you've had a wonderfully interesting background. Give us a little tinkle as to who is Alex Inglot.
Wow, where to start? So in terms of sport, I started playing tennis around the same time as my brother started playing tennis. The problem being that he's 5 years younger than me. So I kind of picked up tennis at 14, 15. He was picking it up seriously at 9 or 10. And being the competitive older brother that I am, I wanted to be better than him, or not let him be better than me, should I say. Never really worked out, not for want of trying, but never really worked out. I played a lot until about 17, 18. Then I converted to volleyball. My maths teacher at school was Polish, and he said, listen, you're tall, you're Polish, so it's in your blood, whether you like it or not, and you're coordinated sports-wise, you should play volleyball. And it kind of started from there. And I played volleyball for I started training with one of the top teams in the UK before university. Then I went to university, played for the university team. After graduation, I played for two of the biggest teams in the UK in the kind of highest level in volleyball. There was no professional volleyball at the time, but I played at the highest level with the top two or three teams. I did that until about my late 20s, 27, 28, at which point my shoulder decided that it was going to retire, even though I didn't want it to. And then I really didn't do much sport at a kind of repetitive, serious level. I mean, did a bit of snowboarding, went to the gym a lot, but it wasn't really until paddle caught my attention, or I should say, caught my brother's attention once he retired, and then he told me that I should get into it, and I kind of started playing right at the beginning of 2023. So that's the kind of shall we say, the sporting performance piece, for want of a better phrase. In terms of the business, that was kind of really always where I wanted my career to go. I started off as a corporate lawyer, doing kind of very dry commercial, contractual corporate law in the city, always with the idea that I would move into sports law, which would then help me get into sports administration. It seemed like a pretty well-worn, well-trodden path. And then, yeah, I spent since about 2009, I've been in the sports industry kind of all in, doing initially communications, international relations around the Olympic space, worked for a football club in Mexico for a year. And then I joined Sportradar, who were kind of one of the biggest businesses in sports data, betting, streaming, and integrity. That was in 2014. And then in 2018, I got the chance to join the board of the ATP as a player representative on the executive board, which was a job of a lifetime, frankly. Did that for about almost 4 years. And then the role I took up in 2000 and have been doing since, and I'm still in, is the commissioner of one of the biggest esports leagues and projects. And that's why I'm in Cologne at the moment, in a hotel room in Cologne, waiting to go to the Lanxess Arena to witness the quarterfinals of the IEM Cologne, which is hosted here every year.
Well, it's a whole other world. Certainly, it must have been fascinating to be on the board of the ATP. The people you're meeting, the dimensions, probably political concepts, because you can see how some tournaments raise that ugly head. And then, of course, you had your brother who was playing in the ATP up until maybe 2 years ago or something like that when he
Yeah.
retired. And that's when I got to have a chance with him. Of course, there are 35 other people who did manage to beat him in the world, and one of which you were not. But that's kind of a rarefied crowd, right? So, in terms of getting into paddle, then you bring your coordination, your volleyball into paddle. Tell us about the kind of player you are. I assume you're somewhat tall, like your brother.
He's a touch taller than me, which was always very frustrating to me, especially when I started playing volleyball, where height is so imperative. I could have done with that extra bit of height that he has. He's, I think, 6'6", and I'm 6'4". What kind of player is
A
it?
minnow, a minnow.
Yeah, well, in volleyball world, sadly, pretty short. But when you look at some of those guys who are 6'8", 6'9", what kind of a player am I? So as you would expect from someone who's got a tennis background, I'm fairly comfortable around the net, volleys, ground strokes. Obviously, like most people who come from tennis, the walls were a little bit of a mystery initially, although I like to believe that I've got a lot more comfortable with them in the last year and a half, 2 years. I'm an aggressive player. I like to attack. I like to smash. I feel like I'm at that really frustrating point in the development of my game where I think I have a really good smash, but what I in fact have is either a Vibora that bounces too high or an X3 that bounces too low. And both of those leave you liable to the counter attack. So I'm desperately trying to separate those two and have a very nice low biting Vibora and having a really nice poppy kicking X3 that regularly goes out. But at the moment, that's where I am. I'm very frustrated with that inability to master both of those.
Isn't it funny, Alex, that we can actually, I can totally visualize the problem. And I know, I mean, my issue, of course, I first of all, I don't have your height, but I also don't have the strength and vitality that I used to have. But I know exactly how to do both. But I somehow don't pull the trigger when it comes to hitting it when it's up there. It's up. Wait. What am I going to do? I'm going to hit the vibro. I'm going to pop it out, and then all of a sudden it comes right back out, and the guy's feeding you. You're eating tennis ball again, or paddle ball, I should say. So your arrival into paddle. Have you played paddle with your brother as well?
Few times we've played 2 or 3 times. I played a couple of weeks back at the NTC courts for the first time with him. Um, I mean, his volley game is ridiculous, as you would expect from a doubles specialist from the tennis world. He doesn't play that much. He's fully committed to golf, as far as I can tell. So he doesn't really have time to squeeze in much of a job, let alone a paddle hobby. But yeah, obviously some of those skills die hard, and so it's great fun playing with him. And it's quite intimidating for the opponents to have, 2 6'4" plus Inglots on the other side of the court.
Indeed. Killer question. Who plays on the left?
I play on the left because I have better technique than him. Even though I've just admitted that I haven't quite got those two separated, he's definitely doesn't. So he hits the ball hard, and it definitely pops up for the other team to kind of put away. Whereas I at least kind of know how to Vibra a bit more. And if I'm not going for an X3 that fails, then I can Vibra fairly well.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is a bit strange because everyone's like, so the 6'6" serving machine from tennis is not on the left. But yeah, both times. I should probably play on the right if I'm honest, but I think my ego doesn't let me. So yeah, the few times we've played, he's been on the right.
Well, and this notion of ego is such a critical component. I tend to also enjoy playing on the left, but I'm 60, and therefore I'm hopefully, or should be playing on the right with any decent player, unless they're left-handed. And this idea of communication, presumably you watch Dom play a lot in doubles. I'd be curious to see how the communication from tennis translates into doubles on the paddle court in terms of how you communicate. And did you have conversations around that, or is that something another step above?
Yeah, I think with my understanding from when I spoke to Dom about his communication on court, it's obviously incredibly strategic, right? It's where am I going to serve? How am I going to serve? What am I trying to achieve? Where do I think the ball's going to go? What does that open up for you? What you as my partner at the net should be ready for? Or where am I going to return my serve or trying to return a serve? It's a lot more about trying to play the percentages. Dom talks a lot about Louis Caillet, who's the doubles specialist who's helped the British doubles guys from Jamie Murray through to Dom, through to all the other guys, the Skupski brothers, etc. They talk a lot about playing the percentages. It's almost like you understand that if you play this shot, the likelihood is this will come back, and therefore the better percentage shot next is this. So it's a lot of planning the point out as much as possible. Obviously, every sport has some jeopardy in terms of unpredictability, but you're trying to play the percentages. I think at least where I am in paddle, I don't really do a lot of talk about strategy. I will sometimes talk about, I mean, the extent of my technical strategy with my partner is I'll say, listen, I'm about to serve with a lot of side spin that's going to cause him a lot of problems in the glass. So sneak in a bit more. I really don't say much more than that. For me, when I play, communication is either just a social communication, like we're having fun, we're bantering. So it's a lot more about ensuring that the social experience is optimal, or encouragement in terms of if something isn't working, the head's coming down, the shoulders are dropping, I'm just trying to encourage them in a playful and positive manner. So I don't. Dom mentioned that from time to time you need to do that depending on your partner. Sometimes partners have kind of mental and kind of shifts, and you need to kind of manage that to a certain degree. But a lot of it is strategy and technical. Whereas I think for me on the paddle court, I really focus on sociability and support.
Well, on the first one, the example that comes to my mind is when your partner double faults, tequila shots, first tequila shot round on you. And that's both social and effective communication, or at least I don't know if effective, but it certainly raises eyebrows. And on the second one, I wanted to talk about a friend called Sandy, who plays a lot of. He's a really gentle mannered man who says, "I don't want to ever hear you say the word sorry when you've screwed up."
Sandy Case from Ice Sports.
Yes,
I know
exactly.
me and my brother were playing against him at the NTC, and we'd never heard this rule before. So that was absolutely the kind of in the background of the whole match, trying to see who said sorry last. It turned out to be my brother, actually, who
Oh,
was that. So yeah, the drinks were on my brother when we went to the restaurant afterwards.
excellent. Well, it's also something of an English saying, right? Sorry for everything. I'm sorry it's raining. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So let's talk about your arrival into the business of paddle, because oh, that was Alexa piping in. In the business of paddle, you obviously have your law degree. You've seen business in many ways, including being the commissioner of the Seasport. Your view on, and what have you learned about the business of paddle in the time that you've been in it?
Wow, that's a big question. I think what I found in the business of paddle, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of excitement, right? And a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of opportunities. You look at the Playtomic report with all of its incredible statistics and growth figures and graphs all pointing in the right direction. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm. And when you go to the summits and the conferences and the events, you can see all of that. People are really buzzing, networking, proposing their ideas, pushing their projects. So I think that's the first thing. There's a lot of enthusiasm, which is really exciting and contagious. I think there's also, and this is where it gets tricky, there's a lot of people who see the opportunity as a short-term opportunity, or who are not really probably fully qualified to be taking forward their respective opportunities. And it's really difficult, even for someone like me who's got a lot of experience in the business of sport, to tell the difference, right? You need to, for all of these club brands that are popping up, for all of these court manufacturers that are popping up, these racket and apparel brands that are popping up, it's really difficult to do the due diligence to understand, is this person going to actually succeed? Especially if you're an investor, which, I've been in the last year or two, and you're trying to think, where do I put my money? Which market and with which operator and within which individual, to do the due diligence and understand the credentials of the individual and the support team or board that they've assembled is really difficult, let alone try to assess the market that they're in. Someone can come to me and say, listen, I'm going to put up some courts in Tulsa, Oklahoma, put some money into me. I'll be like, how do I know that you've got the right location, that Tulsa is good, that, it's got the right demographic? It's really, really difficult to do the due diligence and to separate the wheat from the chaff in and amongst all that enthusiasm. I think there's also that moment where paddle is a hype sport in many ways, not just as an industry, but in terms of the professional circuit. So, the Qataris have come in, they've made a big noise, they've made a big move. Where does the future of professional paddle? Is it going to achieve tier 1 status? How does it do that? Are the revenues that are coming into the professional scene matching the costs that are coming out the other end, because that's a real risk where you can start almost preemptively spending on the assumption that the revenue and the hype will fulfill. If you get that calculation wrong in terms of the numbers or also the timing, it can be really painful for an industry. Because also a lot of people then use those things as a bellwether. They'll go, well, is padel good or not? Let's look at this league, or let's look at this market and decide off the back of that. And if you're looking, for example, at the Swedish market in padel, that's, that's, in some people see that as a stain on the global market. Unless you're learning experiences from that and learning lessons, it becomes something where external investors get nervous. And so you have to be really careful, because the way investors experience a sport, the way fans experience a sport, is really driven by your kind of first impressions. And, if I invest in something and it goes under, then I'm like, well, padel, forget about it. Or if I'm a fan and I go to an event or I go to a club and it's terrible because the courts are awful, that colors my experience. So there's a lot of, how does padel make sure that all of these people who are curious or want to get involved from a business point of view or from a participation point of view have a good experience? That is put in jeopardy by the wrong people presenting themselves as credible or ready or whatever they may be. So, I mean, I love the enthusiasm. I worry about the ability to do due diligence and understand who is credible and who's not credible. And I worry about the hype and making sure that we kind of ride through that hype phase, that we leverage it and use it in a way to make sure we holistically build the foundations for the whole sport, rather than just kind of spike in one area like exclusive clubs and exclusive courts and forget and neglect the rest. But yeah, I think that those are the things that I'm really trying to navigate as I do the podcast and I speak to people and I try and understand things better, and I try and make sure that the listeners have a better sense of the Asian market or the lessons from Sweden, or how does the landscape now evolve for players and their managers. That's really my objective, is to provide that clarity and perspective from people who seem to be leading the way.
Well, I want to finish on talking about your podcast, of course, all the angles. But just before, I wanted to step back into what you were talking about and notice that you said the short-termness of investors. And it certainly feels like when it's a private equity or some financier who's going in for the money, it does feel like the wrong end of the stick as far as the maturity of the industry is concerned. And to what extent you can bring in the culture of padel in this. If it's just a passion project, then you probably aren't so good at the numbers, and that can be a worrisome area, like you mentioned in your podcast about Sweden, about how it began sort of by happenstance around the media, and then things started on. But then you also mentioned Tulsa. Someone's going to wants to build something in Tulsa, so there's a whole contextual element of it, knowing which is the right location, what's the appetite for padel in Tulsa. And then you mentioned Sweden, the lessons learned. But the challenge is inevitably going to be learning the lessons in another context, and then taking what might be the kernels of that might be relevant in Tulsa. And that seems like a very hard stretch. Here's my question. Do you feel that there's something that is more immutable, that is permanent to padel in the lessons you've learned? In other words, universal with regard to padel in business, as opposed to volleyball or tennis? Do you feel that there's something that's specific to padel that will ensure the greatest possibility of success wherever you start up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything revolutionary when I say that the ingredients of padel that make it so exciting and so enjoyable are how easy it is to pick up for anyone who has any sporting coordination, right? It's the entry level, or the entry point for padel is so easy. Of course, I'm not saying it's an easy sport, and there are levels and levels and levels and levels that you can climb and keep you addicted and keep you wanting to improve. But to start enjoying the sport, I look at a sport like volleyball or tennis. Those are really difficult sports to get to a point where you can start enjoying it, where you have the skills and the coordination to make it an enjoyable experience. So I think paddle benefits from that. I think the other thing is that it's innately social because you're in a small space. You have to play doubles pretty much, and the way that, as you said, the kind of the US, not the USP, one of the yeah, I guess one of the USPs of paddle, especially from where it comes from in Spain and Argentina, is this social environment, the kind of the drinks before, the restaurant after. So that's all kind of baked into paddle in its DNA. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I think is the way that paddle, because of the timing, has been fortunate enough to really embrace the technology that comes around the apps and the matchmaking piece, which have really, if I think about if I wanted to play volleyball now, or if I want to even play tennis now, or when I wanted to play tennis back, 20, 30 years ago, that didn't exist. And so the ability to find people at the right level, to find people at the right time, to find people that I get on with, and then to make that such an easy, user-friendly experience. Paddle is kind of, again, has baked that into its DNA now, and that is a real opportunity. So I think those ingredients, as long as you harness those ingredients, embrace those ingredients, and build on those ingredients, you're in a good place. What I fear, as I mentioned in the previous answer, is this kind of, and I think you touched on it as well, the idea that private businesses are always moving a lot faster than any kind of community or public entity. And that disparity of speed is what's causing the delta between the proliferation of exclusive clubs and courts versus the proliferation of community accessible courts. And that worries me because I don't think that's a long-term play for participation, because it establishes a reputation that this sport is elitist. And so a lot of people will just switch off from it immediately. And it also is bad for the professional scene because there'll be a smaller base of the pyramid who are going to be interested in following that sport because it's an elite sport. And that if that delta, or if that issue isn't resolved or corrected, you're going to have a really small pool of people to choose from or to engage with. So I think the sport needs to find a way to support and collaborate with the public institutions, whether that's funding, whether that's collaboration, whether that's pressure, whatever it may be. But I don't think, as I'm seeing in the UK, as I'm seeing in the US, and maybe was also in other markets, this idea that the private sector is just going to do its own thing. We're not going to support it as a public entity, but we're just going to let it do its thing, and we'll kind of chug along at our speed as a public institution or community institution. That is not the right answer, because that delta is just growing. And I think that's really unhealthy. In that space, as it expands, is a disconnect. So that's what I hope. I know that some people are more proactive than others, but to leave it to the enthusiasm or morals, I should say, moral values of certain operators and CEOs, it's got to be better than that. It's got to be more holistic than that.
Well, it does find an echo in the history of paddle, in the way that Argentina popped up in the 80s, in the late 70s and 80s. At one point, there were 30,000 courts in Argentina, and it was like pickup basketball. Everyone was just playing on every street corner. The nets were just a line across, on some sort of a metal line, as opposed to a bona fide net. They didn't have the 4 meter walls either. They just had concrete everywhere. And so it was a very different game and completely accessible, which explains how Argentina is where it is today. But like you say, other than Spain, everything else seems most countries seem to be promoting a higher end. And that's a very valuable insight. And I also liked your insight with regard to the tech, it being born with the DNA of tech. That's a super smart insight, Alex. So let's finish with all about your podcast, which is powered by Hexagon Cup. I've had Enrique Buenaventura on my show as well. So let's talk about what you're trying to do with your podcast, because you got mentioned one of the top 6 podcasts on a lovely site. I was very excited to be part of that as well. Yeah. But that's fun. So the idea of doing the business of paddle as a podcast. Where did that idea come up, and how did Hexagon get involved with you?
Good question. Yeah, so I've spent most of my sports career, and definitely my early part of my sports career, in B2B business communications and public relations and media. And so I've grown up in my career reading the likes of Sports Pro, Sport Business Journal, more recently Sportico. These are kind of publications that are really no nonsense business publications for the sports sector. And so that's my bread and butter and what I find interesting. And I just couldn't find anything like that regularly like that in the paddle world, at least not in the English speaking world. There may be pockets of it in the Spanish speaking world, but I know there's Paddle Biz podcast, which has a bit more of a business slant than your average podcast. But I really wanted to dive into the business stories on a regular basis. And again, it pops up on different websites, it pops up on different media, it pops up on different podcasts, but it's not like the focus, the main objective. So that was my first piece. That was the first piece. I wanted to digest it. If it didn't exist, I was happy to create it. The second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to bridge what felt like this strange standoff between the legacy world of paddle, like Spain and Argentina, and the new world of Scandinavia, Middle East, UK, US, more English speaking. It felt like there was this kind of unspoken tension where it felt like the new guard was saying, yeah, no, you started it, but we're going to take it to the next level. Whereas the established places were like, what are you talking about? We've been doing this sport for 40, 50 years. We created it. We're doing perfectly well. We're doing perfectly innovatively. And actually, you've probably got more to learn from us than we have to learn from you. And there's this kind of feeling like the language obviously didn't help, that, you had the Spanish world and the non-Spanish world. And one of the pictures I had, well, the first thing I had in my mind was I want to bridge that gap, because I think, Spanish markets can learn from Sweden, but Spanish markets can learn from the US. There's so much that can be learned from these two silos, for want of a better phrase. And I really wanted to bridge that in the content, in the guests, in the subjects. And so that's really why I came to Hexagon Cup, because I'd been speaking to Enrique for about a year already, just kind of around business opportunities and around the Hexagon Cup before it even had its first edition. And when he was talking about his product, the word that came into my head, this was way before even all the angles, was bridge, right? He was bridging the men and the women's game. He was bridging the established names with the next gen. He was bridging paddle fandom with celebrities who can then tap into fans who would not normally kind of engage with paddle. So it's all about creating bridges. And so when I was thinking, if all the angles is going to be a bridge between the Spanish-speaking legacy world and the, let's say, for want of a better phrase, English-speaking new frontier, then I want someone to help me that believes in that value. And also I want to unlock Spanish speaking. I'm not a very good Spanish speaker. So I wanted someone who could say, we need to do more Spanish episodes, or we've got a Spanish speaking like legend friend who can come into this episode or that episode. So really the Hexagon Cup really proved to me, based on a value system and based on their contact base and reputation, and also the fact that they know how to run a sport from their Formula E days, so they have that business of sport credibility. It felt like the perfect people to kind of come in and fill in the gaps that I would have if I just did this as a solo enterprise. And so that was the philosophy. Let's purely focus on business. Let's be informal in tone, but rigorous in content. And let's try and see where we can. I really didn't want it to feel like this is a UK podcast, or this is a European podcast, or this is an America's podcast. I really wanted to build those bridges and that connecting tissue in every episode to the extent possible. Of course, we may look at Asia for one market or Sweden for another market, but where subjects are more global, I really wanted to have people from different places sharing stories, so that a businessman from Spain who's been doing this for 30 years has something to learn, and a guy from a US state who wants to launch his first club can still learn something. So that was really where it came from. And we're 5 or 6 episodes in. I'm really humbled by the profile of speakers I've managed to attract. obviously it's a slow burn with podcasts in terms of the numbers, and
Tell me about it.
I've tried not to focus too much on those numbers because for me, this isn't my primary focus in terms of my time and energy. But I do hope that over time, someone will see it, find an episode that they like the format, like the content, go back, and it will grow. Because if it ends up being an archive of useful perspectives on incredibly important issues in the paddle business ecosystem, then I'll have achieved what I want to achieve.
I think I agree with you on that. I like that understanding of what the podcast world is all about, and I very much enjoyed your. I've pretty much listened to every one of your episodes. One of the things that struck me, Alex, was that you are able to manage multiple guests. It's always been a challenge for me, especially across a Zoom, especially when you got the visual going. So I have to say, like I'm pointing, so you speak, as opposed to or a head nod to how to manage to figure out who's going to speak next. Anyway, Alex, the All About Angles. How can people find out about your podcast? Assuming the people who are listening to this one know about podcasts, they're going to have usually an easy time to come onto yours. All About All the Angles. How do they find that? How do they get in touch with you if they want to know more about what you're up to and get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the website is alltheangles.biz, B-I-Z. That's kind of the hub. It's got all the episodes on it and all the details and contact details. You can find it on YouTube every week. We put up a episode every Tuesday on a weekly basis. Also, it's on all the podcast platforms you would expect. I use Buzzsprout so that they share the gospel across all the traditional, your Apple, your Spotify, etc. So those are really the ways. The best way to reach me is through the website or alex.inglot@alltheangles.biz. I am super keen. I haven't really had too many people bite, but I am super keen to understand what people think about the format, the content, the subjects. What do I need to change? What do I need to improve? What would make it more enjoyable for the people in the business? What issues would they love covered? Which speaker absolutely needs to be approached and got onto my podcast? I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this because I want the audience to resonate with what I'm putting out there. So if there's a speaker or a subject that I haven't addressed and they're like, you have got to do something on Australia, or you've got to do something on the Antarctic, whatever it may be.
South Africa. I was just back from Cape Town.
Yeah, I've got plenty of ideas about episodes I want to do and people I want to speak to, but yeah, I'm sure I don't have my full coverage. So I need the audience to give me all the angles as much as I can, hopefully then reflect it back through the episodes.
Wonderful. Well, you heard it from Alex, how to reach you and how to get in touch and find out more about all the angles. Alex, gracias muchísimas. Vamos.
Gracias a ti.